He had wealth, power, and anything money could provide, save his mourning daughter peace. Then came along Grace, a lowly woman with no standing, only a patient heart. What she did next stunned an entire world. Was she the help, or something much more? You won't believe how one steady presence transformed a broken family forever. There's play to get started. Sometimes the person we're told not to trust becomes the very one who saves us. It's interesting how one choice, one tiny yes, can silently alter the path of a life. Not forcefully, not dramatically, but with something much stronger. Presence. This is what this story is about. This is about a man who possessed everything, yet not peace. A child who had no words to say, and a woman the world neglected, who had more strength than people knew until it was most needed. Now, he was not a man who ever required assistance, not ever. He'd constructed his world on success, fortune, control. When things went broke, he mended them. When individuals failed, he replaced them. It was simpler that way, clean, orderly. But sorrow does not operate on business principle. And when his wife unexpectedly passed away, leaving behind their reserved 7-year-old daughter, all the wealth in the universe could not purchase back what was lost. He expected it to be easy to hire someone to look after his daughter. Dozens showed up, shining credential. But none of them could touch the silence his little girl had descended into. Then, one day, a quiet woman named Grace walked through the door. She didn't arrive with flash, no designer shoes, no high-end portfolio. Just steady eyes, still hands, and a quiet sense that she'd survived her own storm. She didn't market herself, she didn't attempt to wow, and when he asked her why she wanted to work there, she just said, "Because I know what it's like to lose a mother, and to need someone who stays." That was the point at which everything changed, though nobody realized it yet. At first, the house was still cold, not only from the marble floors or open spaces, but from the void that loomed over it. His daughter Leela hadn't smiled in weeks, spoke barely at all, but Grace didn't prod, didn't suffocate the air with forced cheer. Rather, she braided the little girl's hair in the mornings, hummed through the evening, cooked pancakes in heart shapes. Quietly, each day, she gave something the child never knew she was still missing: quiet love. And gradually, Lila started coming back, a whisper first, then a question. Then a laugh, dancing barefoot around the kitchen to old Motown tunes. Not a miracle, not in the front page way, but to a mourning father, it might as well have been. But beyond that residence, the world paid attention. Whispers started circulating. Why her? Why that woman? His peers questioned his taste. His deceased wife's family claimed she didn't fit. She came from the wrong side of town, the wrong background, the wrong everything. Things people won't say in words, but get across in tone and looks, in what they don't feel like absorbing. And the man who once made decisions without blinking suddenly found himself hesitating until one night, after a long day of meetings, he came home to something he hadn't expected. Grace, suitcase in hand, quietly getting ready to leave. She wasn't angry. She wasn't dramatic. She simply said, "I never meant to cause trouble. Maybe this isn't where I'm meant to be." But as she had turned to leave, the gentle patter of small feet had filled the air. Leela had run in, frantic. Her little voice broke as she had clung to Grace's leg. "Are you leaving me too?" And that was the moment that changed everything. Thomas, this man who had flown from ocean to ocean and signed contracts worth billions of dollars, went down on his knees. He laid his hand on his daughter's back and stared at Grace, not as an employer, not as a man from another world, but as a father, a human being. And he declared with absolute conviction, "She's not the help, she's family." The weeks that followed were a quiet revolution. He stood up for Grace, not only in secret but in public. He defied his board, his social network, his detractors. And he spoke the truth. "This woman saved my daughter's spirit when I didn't know how. That's worth more than every dollar in my account." And he meant it. But the most unthinkable act came later, months after the dust had finally settled. Thomas made a public statement. He wasn't merely beginning a foundation in his wife's name. He was appointing Grace Holloway its first director, and more besides. Made her Lila's legal godmother. Handed over part of the child's future, not out of duty, but out of love, gratitude, trust. Others described it as shocking. Others claimed he was mad. But Thomas was aware. He had watched this easy way of ignoring someone simply because they don't fit the mold. He had watched what bravery and commitment were like when there was no one to applaud, and he had learned in the most intimate way possible that sometimes the most crucial person in the room is the one everyone else overlooks. Grace didn't do it for praise or pay. She remained because she knew what it felt like to be invisible and opted to look at someone else instead. Her unassuming strength mended a little girl's heart and reminded a mighty man of something he hadn't experienced in years: peace. This tale isn't one of headlines or heroic acts. It's about the strength of remaining. of staying alone to love when it is difficult, of looking beyond fear and pride and status, and believing in what the heart understands, and perhaps it's one for us as well. How many times have we rejected someone for not looking the part? How many times do we forget that kindness is a choice, and that healing begins in the most basic of places? As you listen to the narrative that follows, I encourage you to lean in not only to the drama or the suffering, but to the soft, steady beauty that exists between the lines. Because in a culture that worships power and noise, it's tales like these, quiet, real human, that tell us what truly is essential. He was accustomed to having people say yes to him. Thomas Wexler wasn't merely wealthy, he was influential. A man who shook markets with a phone call, who sat on boards, had properties on either coast, and never needed to ask twice for anything. Money made most things run smoothly, predictably, but not this, not sorrow. That morning, light poured across the gleaming marble of his Manhattan penthouse, but air inside was heavy quiet in a way that didn't feel serene, only hollow. Thomas sat at the large dining table converted into an interview table, scanning the fifth resume of the day. And then she appeared, not in stilettos or designer labels, not with a polished folder and pressed smile like the others. No, she was different. She went by the name of Grace Holloway and had no pretense. She appeared to be in her early 50s, her short natural hair framing her kind, observant eyes. Her attire was plain but clean, pressed with attention to detail. She had that aura, solid, tranquil, as if having ridden out storms most people never speak of. Thomas saw it immediately. She did not sit fidgety. She didn't pitch herself like a product. She simply waited as he scanned her resume. He heard the soft clink of puzzle pieces behind him. His 7-year-old daughter, Leela, sat cross-legged on the carpet in the other room, her face empty, her small fingers gradually attempting to decipher something in. Fragments of puzzle, yes, but also her life. She hadn't said much in weeks, not since the funeral. End of affairs as wife. Claire had passed away only 3 months prior. Stage 4 ovarian cancer. It had come suddenly, aggressively. No time to prepare. One day they were making a family vacation to the lake. The next, he was sitting with her in a cold hospital room, vowing he'd look after Lila no matter what. But he didn't know how. Money wouldn't mend a broken heart. Therapists came and went. Nannies quit just as fast. Some complained that Lila was too quiet. Others complained that she needed professional help. One even referred to her as difficult, but the real truth was straightforward. She had missed her mother, and Thomas didn't know how to replace it. He didn't want another perfected caregiver with a dissertation degree. He wanted someone genuine, someone who'd stick around. So he set the paper down and questioned Grace with the question he'd posed to everyone else that day, but this time with more sincerity. Why do you want this job? Grace didn't blink, didn't stutter. She gazed at him directly and replied, because I know what it feels like to lose a mother. And to require someone who stays. The room went silent. There had been no pitch, no performance, only silent truth. And in some way, that truth resonated through the noise in his head more than any slick reference ever could. She didn't know their world, not the one of stock options and fund, raising catered to, and yet something about her felt profoundly familiar, like the pre-noise world. Thomas looked over at Leela, who was gazing at Grace from across the room, her puzzle left behind. For an instant, the two held each other's gaze, and although nothing was said, something passed between them, curiosity, or maybe even hope. Claire would tell her, "You'll know the right person when you feel like you can breathe again." And in that instant, for the first time in so long, Thomas had a full breath. He closed the folder and stood up. "Can you begin tomorrow?" he asked. Grace nodded once. No surprise, no enthusiasm, only still acceptance, as if she was always supposed to be there. He didn't know it yet, but the hiring of Grace Holloway would prove to be the most significant thing he'd ever done, not for his business, not for his reputation, but for that one thing his wealth could never acquire, his daughter's love. The house was cold, not merely due to the high ceilings, stone floors, and glass walls that amplified the sound of each step, but due to something much denser, silence. Not the calm variety, but the kind that gathers around a house like dust upon shattering. Ever since Claire's death, small, Lila, only 7 years old, had withdrawn into that silence, drawing into herself like a flower upon being kissed by frost. Therapists had also arrived and departed, bearing degrees, games, and well-rehearsed strategies, but none had penetrated to her. Teachers were kind but baffled. Withdrawn, one described her. Emotionally flat, said another. Those terms seemed too analytical for what Thomas witnessed. A small girl who had lost her mooring, and no one, not a father who was a billionaire, could purchase back the voice of a mother or the arms that had previously rendered everything safe. But Grace never attempted to repair her. She did not come into the house like a storm of solutions or with a clipboard of solutions for behaviors. She came quietly, gently. She arrived every morning with her hair modestly covered, her eyes gentle and tolerant. She prepared Lila's favorite breakfast, blueberry pancakes cut out in the shape of hearts, without even asking what she preferred. She simply knew. She never asked Lila to speak or open herself or tell her about how she felt. She just braided her own hair, smoothed her own forehead when the girl couldn't sleep, and sat quietly beside her at night, humming not any tune in specific, just soft sounds that somehow sufficed for what words couldn't cover. And slowly, as spring came back to wintered trees, a change began. One night, the rain was rattling lightly against the windows, and the house was muffled in that sort of silence that precedes something significant. Lila was snuggled under a blanket, looking out into the storm. Then she turned her face and whispered, "Will you sing the same song my mommy sang?" Grace went still for an instant, her heart lurching in her chest. Her eyes welled up, but she refused to let the tears fall. She did not know the song, not exactly, but she refused to let it keep her from singing. Rather, she sang softly, tentatively, making a lullaby of comfort without any words at all, just a melody that took room for Lila's memory to fill in. And something in that room happened that could not be recorded on a medical chart. A bridge built, silent, unseen, but profound. From that evening on, the transformation was gradual but continuous. Lila hummed to herself. She began to put her own dish on the table. Then the questions arose, small ones initially. Can I stir the batter? Do we have pens? But indicators that her soul was reviving again. And Grace, whose steady calm and gentle patience continued to arrive. Every little gain was greeted with delight, but never with pressure. She allowed Lila to take the lead, always on her own terms. Thomas could see it too, although at first he couldn't quite define what was different. It was in the way Lila regarded him when he returned home, how she started meeting his gaze once more, how her sketches went back into the fridge, and one night he arrived home late from a long meeting and discovered something he hadn't seen in months: life. The hallway, he could hear laughter, actual silvery laughter, not artificial or courteous. He opened the door to the kitchen and was presented with the most astonishing sight. Grace and Lila, both barefoot, making slow, silly figure eights across the tile floor, music drifting from an old Bluetooth speaker on the counter. It wasn't contemporary pop or kids music, it was Motown, Smokey Robinson, Diana Ross. Grace grasped Lila's hands and warbled along with the songs off-key but happily as Lila doubled over laughing. For what was a very long minute, Thomas did not stir. He stood there observing, a smile playing at his lips, something warm returning to life in his chest. Hope, it was that. Pure, unexpected, unpurchasable hope. It had been so long since it had occurred to him that he didn't recognize it immediately at first. But there it was, spinning in the kitchen, swathed in an old soul tune, with a little girl's giggles calling the shots. It didn't heal all of it, of course. Sorrow never fully departs. But somehow, in the company of this woman, this surprise, earthy, loving woman, his daughter was learning to live again, and for a man who believed he had lost it all, that meant something. That was nothing less than a miracle, but not everybody was pleased. The warmth that was growing in the Wexler house, the laughter, the music, the gradual resurgence of Lila's heart was not echoed outside its doors. Whispers started softly, the way they usually do, circulating around gilded dinner tables, beneath crystal chandeliers. And behind the sliding conference room doors where suited men savored espresso and considered themselves wise, news had spread. Thomas Wexler, billionaire, widower, and stalwart of the city's high society, had brought a black woman from the south side of town in to take care of his daughter. That, to them, was news. Not due to her talent or the healing they could not behold, but due to where she was from, due to what she resembled. That she wasn't one of them, they whispered, the words said in short, cautious sentences, their forced smiles tight, but their eyes full of condemnation. "Is this really whom you want shaping your child?" asked one colleague at a charity gala, sipping his wine with the confidence of a man who'd never had to question his own place at the table. "I'm just saying," another murmured. "Be careful. Some people take advantage of situations like this." These weren't strangers. They were his investors, his board members, his so-called friends, and their discomfort was not loud, but it was constant, a slow wearing away, like water seeping into cracks in stone. Thomas dismissed it at first. Let them speak, he thought. They didn't know Grace. They hadn't witnessed the light come back to Lila's eyes, the ring of her laughter in the halls. They didn't get it, but with the passage of time, the remarks became more pungent, not louder, just more acerbic. There were sidelong glances in meetings whenever her name was mentioned. One executive asked if he had done a background check on her, as though love and trust needed a money background check. Even her late wife's. Sister Caroline, who had always been protective of Lila, steered him aside one afternoon after a fundraiser. Her voice was low, her tone fraught with something almost cruel. Thomas, she said, gripping his arm with that too. Firm politeness. I know you're grieving, but she doesn't belong in this world. You're making decisions Claire wouldn't have agreed with. He felt the sting of her words, not because they were true, but because they mirrored something he hadn't admitted to himself. He was afraid, not of Grace, never of Grace, but of what it meant to stand against the tide. Of how simple it would be to remain quiet, to allow others' awkwardness to inform his choices. But what really unsettled him occurred not in a boardroom or a charity gala, but at home. One evening, following a vicious 14-hour day of dealing with his people, grasping profit margins, and diplomatically veiled condescension, he came home to a house that should have been a sanctuary, but wasn't. It was too still. He dropped his briefcase against the door and shouted for Lila silence. He caught her sleeping in bed, clutching the frayed scarf Grace wore when she read to her. That's when he saw the open door to the guest room. The closet was half full. A suitcase sat by the bed, meticulously zipped. In the living room, Grace was folding the last sweater. She didn't seem surprised when he walked in, just quiet, polite, but with tears in her eyes. Grace, he said, bewildered, heart pounding. What's going on? She didn't shout. She never did. Never meant to make a fuss, she said quietly, running her hands over the fabric in a way that let him know this was not the first time she'd been getting out a bag like this. You've been nice. Lila's a beautiful girl, but maybe this isn't where I'm meant to be. He was stunned. Speechless even. He had faced down competitors, lawsuits, market crashes, but this felt like watching the walls of his world shift again, just when he thought they'd settled. And the terrifying part wasn't that she was leaving. It was the sudden, sharp realization of what her absence would mean. Lila would break. That Sedef, Nade, laugh. Again, the silence would come back, and this time, perhaps it would remain. Thomas had his mouth open to reply, but nothing emerged, at least not at first, because in that instant he realized something profoundly, achingly true. He had allowed other people's fears to be heard more loudly than his own heart. He had watched as those around him, those who complimented his business acumen but never met his daughter, attempted to determine who belonged in their world, and worse, he'd allowed Grace to experience it herself, the rejection, the loneliness. He recalled all the times he'd find her kneeling at Lila's bedside, speaking affirmations into the darkness, the manner in which she'd come to know his daughter's moods without ever having a user's manual, the late nights spent sewing buttons onto Lila's lucky sweater simply because it was her lucky sweater. None of that could be substituted, not by a resume, not by the right contacts, and suddenly the price became apparent not in dollars, but in something infinitely more delicate, trust, healing, love, and he knew in his bones he was going to lose something much more valuable than money. Don't leave, Thomas whispered, his own voice breaking in a manner he had not permitted himself in years. Not in business, not even at the funeral. It was not the tone of a billionaire or a boardroom leader. It was the tone of a man, merely a man, witnessing something irreplaceable pass out of his hands. Grace stood waiting by the front door, her suitcase ready, her eyes gentle but firm. She hadn't demanded a scene. She wasn't theatric. She was only doing what she believed was correct, getting out of a world that had reminded her quietly, mercilessly, that she didn't belong. But when Thomas moved to intervene, that shiny world he'd spent decades constructing now felt tissue, paper thin. He had constructed businesses, yes, negotiated mergers, in glass skyscrapers, flown overseas in private aircraft, and stood next to presidents and kings. But none of it had prepared him for the thud of his daughter's feet racing down the hall. Lila tore into the room, face white, eyes wide with alarm. She'd heard, she knew. Are you leaving me too? She wept, small fists clenching around Grace's leg, holding fast. That single sentence, one so plain, so brutal, broke something loose in the room. Grace's face contorted. She did not budge, could not. Thomas's knees landed on the hardwood as he dropped beside his daughter, his pricey bespoke suit creasing heedlessly. He put one hand on Lila's back, the other on Grace's arm. His voice was stable now, firm but not loud. Grace isn't leaving, he said, and every sentence seeped in truth. She's not the help, she's family. There was silence, but not the isolating kind. It was a silence that was rich with recognition, something fitting into place that had been overdue for too long. Thomas spoke from the heart, not from the wallet, for the first time in years. Navered Cell. He understood that he had spent so long attempting to stay in control, to guard Lila, to prevent his world from falling apart after Claire died, that he had not taken the time to see that the one person who had already done what he believed was impossible was standing in front of him. She had revived his daughter. Not with equipment or protocol, but with love, with being present, with profound, unshakable devotion. The following day, he faced his board, men and women who had seen him as nothing other than cutting, clever, unmoving, and he explained what needed explanation. Some of you believe I've made a mistake. He started voice level, that I've let my personal life get in the way of my judgment. But the reality is, what Grace Holloway did for my child can't be quantified in your spreadsheets or compared to your quarterly profits. My little girl ceased talking, when she ceased smiling, when I had no idea what to do or to whom to turn. No therapist, no teacher, no consultant reached her. It was Grace. She brought laughter back to our household. She made my daughter Trist feel safe again. And if any of you can meet my eye and tell me that isn't worth more than everything in my bank account, then I'm not sure we're even speaking the same language. Some were taken aback, others attempted neutrality, but just a few nodded, eyes softening, understanding coming. Later on, he told the same to his neighbors, his friends, even to Claire's sister. Grace remains here, he said to them, not out of guilt, not out of obligation. She remains here because she is home, because Lila chose her. Because she earned it with each bedtime book, each braid, each quiet moment when love spoke louder than words. And in the midst of it all, Grace, who had always been content to serve quietly behind the scenes, stood there dumbfounded, not because she wanted praise, but because for the first time in her life she was seen. Not as a caregiver, not as a background presence, but as a woman, as a guide, as one whose quiet everyday decisions had remade the life of an aching child and the heart of an aching man. Tears filled her eyes, but not out of sorrow, out of the unendurable weight of being loved, not for what she was able to do, but for who she was, and that altered everything. Months later, far beyond the point when the rumors had disappeared after the front entrance. No longer witnessed reporters and doubters attempting to get a look at the unconventional nanny. Thomas Wexler appeared on the porch of the Wexler Foundation Hall and did something that no one in his universe anticipated. He didn't merely establish a foundation in the name of his late wife Claire, although even that was a big thing, paying tribute to the woman who had once hoped to provide opportunities for education and mental health services to underserved children. No, the moment that truly shifted the air was when he looked out at the crowd of donors, board members, cameras, and doubters and said with the same steady conviction he once reserved for multi-billion-dollar decisions, I'd like to introduce our first executive director, Grace Holloway. The room went quiet, not from confusion, but from surprise. Some people smiled politely, unsure of how to react. Others whispered behind their hands. Some, those that had criticized her months before, looked at each other with barely concealed astonishment. Thomas didn't let it end there, for this wasn't symbolic, this wasn't charity, this wasn't about image management, this was justice, this was clear-headedness, this was love. He continued to say that Grace wouldn't only head up the foundation, she would have a place in his family that was permanent. With quiet authority, he told her that he had revised his will, made his legal affairs in order, and designated Grace not only as Lila's godmother, but as trustee of her future. She would help direct Lila's life and education, her emotional health, not as an employee, but as family. The press exploded the following morning. Billionaire leaves fortune in charge of nanny, blared one. Stunning choice or scandal, mused another. Others called it dumb. A few labeled it crazy, but Thomas called it correct. He didn't react to the sound. He didn't feel compelled to justify his heart to those who'd never lost what he'd lost or witnessed a child degenerate into sorrow and creep back to health through the silent, everyday beauty of a woman the world wouldn't wholly understand. He just lived by the truth he had learned. Sometimes the strongest thing anyone can do is believe the person the world says not to. Not because it's simple, not because it's secure, but because they've worked for it not with words but with deeds and grace. Grace didn't bat an eye when news broke. She didn't braggadocio, didn't brag. When interviewed, she politely declined. It's not about me, she said. It's about Lila, and really it always had been. She hadn't come on for the money, although the money was good. She hadn't remained for attention, although she now had it. She had remained because she knew how to be motherless as a child, to feel invisible, to see the world move on when your small heart softly shatters. She had remained because many years prior to walking into that house, she had sworn to herself that if she were ever presented with the opportunity to be the individual she once required her to be, then she would. And so, she was that individual for Lila. She was there every day, every night. Through tantrums and nightmares, through somber days and sobbing ones, not with big gestures, but with unbreakable presence, with pancakes cut into hearts, with humming at bedtime and braids in her hair, with love that never asked for thanks. She did the unexpected. She stayed. And in the end, that was the unthinkable act. Because in a world addicted to speed, to status, to shortcuts and self-marketing, she decided to simply be there, fully, faithfully. And by doing so, she didn't only alter the life of one small girl, she altered a father's heart, defied a broken system, and reminded everyone in sight that sometimes the most world-altering thing isn't loud or flashy. It's quiet, consistent, unshakable. At times, it appears to be love that doesn't leave. Sometimes life astonishes us not with big, flashy moments, but in the simple choices individuals make when nobody is looking. Grace didn't seek to establish herself. She merely appeared with love, repeatedly, even when the world attempted to make her feel insignificant. And by doing so, she taught us that genuine strength is not always about prestige or authority. It's about remaining when it's simpler to leave, about caring above convenience. We all face moments where we're asked, silently or otherwise, to decide what really matters. This story isn't just about a billionaire or a child in mourning. It's about the healing power of kindness, the dignity in doing what's right even when it's misunderstood, and the courage it takes to be someone's anchor. And perhaps it's a gentle reminder to observe the people around us and ask ourselves, who are we missing? And what loveliness may we discover if we simply took the time to notice?